Well, once again, good morning, and I think we will go ahead and get started with session one of the Engineering Ideas Institute Engineering Change Lab Summit. Um, Welcome again to everybody on behalf of the Engineering Change Lab Steering Committee and Board of Directors. We're glad that you're taking part in our first virtual summit. My name is Mike McMeekin. I am the Executive Director of the Engineering Change Lab USA, and I am speaking today from Omaha, Nebraska. And just for your information, we are recording the summit sessions, and we'll see what we do with that after. We sincerely hope that this virtual summit will come as close as possible to the learning environments that we experience in our in-person Engineering Change Lab summits. And hopefully you reviewed my email from earlier today, which includes some important information regarding the summit, particularly what to do if you run into any technical problems. So I've got a brief presentation to share to start today's program. So, give me a minute here. I've got a Zoom bar blocking my PowerPoint bar, so. All right. If one of the co-hosts sees anybody trying to get in while I'm doing this, if you could let them in while I'm talking, because I can't see that.
Yeah, Mike, I'll go ahead and take care of that.
All right, thank you, Joe. All right, so just to kick us off, Engineering Change Lab USA has been an official tax-exempt nonprofit organization now for a little over a year. In 2019, we received a generous grant from NCEES that allowed us to go into operation. And NCEES recently awarded us a second grant. And we are really grateful for that support. And particular thanks to David Cox, the Executive Director of NCEES, and Brian Robertson, NCEES board member, who are joining us in this summit. I also want to thank the other firms who are shown on this slide: Lamprey Niersen, Pinion Environmental, Degenkolb, and Walter P. Moore, who have all stepped up to be our initial corporate contributors. And these firms are represented in the summit today by Nancy Predal, Lauren Evans, Stacy Bartoletti, and Edwin Friedrichs. Give me a minute here. Okay. The organizations shown on this slide have demonstrated their support of Engineering Change Lab by registering multiple people for Summit 9. And we also appreciate this recognition of the value of the learning that we provide. Just to remind everybody of the vision and mission of Engineering Change Lab, the vision begins with the technological and environmental challenges of the future and the imperative for the engineering community to increase its contributions to addressing these challenges. And from these came our mission to be a catalyst for change within the engineering community, helping it to reach its highest potential on behalf of society. Through our work, we hope to continue to explore the important questions about the future of engineering. What technological disruptors will have the greatest impact? What other industry and societal trends could be disruptive? What role will all of our organizations play as stewards of technology and the environment? and how will our organization impact public policy? Is the engineering educational system supporting or hindering our future? And what are potential impacts from threats to licensure? And finally, what will each of us do to protect the future of the engineering community? The role of ECL is to be a change agent and prepare more engineers and more engineering organizations to look to the future through addressing these questions. And if you are aware of other organizations or individuals that should be engaged in the work of Engineering Change Lab, please reach out to me. And with that, I would like to introduce Kyle Davey, who's our program designer and facilitator for the summit. Kyle's dedication to the work of ECL and his deep knowledge of the issues that we are exploring are invaluable. And I apologize for all of you seeing my notes. We'll fix that in the next summit. So with that, Kyle, it's all yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see you by Zoom. It's not as much fun as being there in person and having, you know, over the previous hour, the chance to chat with people and check in and shake hands and introduce myself and learn a little bit about new participants with the lab. But it's good to be here with you this morning. We've got this Google Doc that we're running parallel to the Zoom window. If you do have it open, I put it up on the screen share here, and we'll be using this document really as our shared flip chart. Those of you that have been in sessions with me before realize, you know, we heavily rely on flip charts for both, you know, talking about things up front in the circle of chairs that we have, but also for doing small group work. So this really is the way that we think we can accomplish that part of the environment that we normally create in person. Just a couple notes with regard to the session itself. You can see the objective, or first, you know, Mike mentioned, you know, this is the first of 4 modules for this Learning Institute that we put together. The 4 modules really all build on major points of inquiry that have surfaced in the first 8 summits. And what we're trying to do, those of you that have been with us before will know this model, but for the new folks, generally what we try and do is characterize the process that the Change Lab is engaged in as following what you can think of as a deep U model. This model comes from Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer originally, and the notion of the U is that coming down into the U, you are basically sensing what's going on in the environment. As you reach the bottom of the view, you're beginning to make sense of what you've picked up, and then as you come out of the U, you're beginning to just take action, launch experiments and other ways of learning in order to generate the change that you're seeking. Well, that's the overall model for the Change Lab, but it also reflects the work that we do in each one of the sessions. They're sort of mini U's. And as we've done that in the past, 4 particular topics had come up that we felt merited additional work with regard to going deeper into that inquiry. The first is the technological driving forces, which we've looked at in the past in terms of seeing how those will impact the engineering community and practice. But in particular, we wanted to look at one aspect of that, which is what we're characterizing as the entanglement of technology, society, and engineering, and, you know, begin to, you know, have more inquiry around that. Second module around work that we were introduced to in Houston from that the Lemelson and VentureWell foundations are doing, beginning to roll out the development of environmentally responsible engineering as a fundamental piece of the educational experience for engineers going through college programs. And we wanted to see if we could contribute by having an inquiry into what does leadership for environmentally responsible engineering look like. And that'll be module 2 that we'll be doing tomorrow. The third module builds on work that Beth Cady, who's with us today, introduced us to in Kansas City about a year and a half ago. And there, you know, we began to look at issues around diversity and inclusion, and the fact that the system seemed to be stuck with regard to making progress with regard to those dimensions of engineering practice and the population, et cetera. And that we really wanted to look at that more deeply. That'll be session 3, which happens a week from today on August 5th. And then finally in session 4, we want to build on work again that we started in Kansas City that looked at how to enable engineers to more proactively engage in shaping public policy rather than just being seen as technical experts that might generate a white paper or provide advice, but not be seen in leadership roles with regard to that. So those are the 4, you know, deep U experiences that we've lined up for the next 2 weeks, starting today, tomorrow, and then Wednesday, Thursday of next week. So let me talk specifically about the work we'll be doing today. It's really focused on this notion of the social impacts of technology, or what Thomas Hughes, who was one of the great historians of technology out there, he would characterize, or had made the statement that society and technology are entangled together. And engineers really are at the center of that entanglement as creators and stewards of technology. And so we wanted to use this session to better understand the nature of that entanglement and how engineers can successfully work with that entanglement in the future in order to fulfill the mission that Mike had outlined earlier today, that notion of raising the potential contribution that engineers can make to society by being more able to live within that entanglement and develop constructive, productive outcomes. So that'll be the work that we're going to be exploring. That sets up the agenda. And basically where we're going to go here is we've got 3 provocateurs coming in to start us off in terms of thinking about different aspects of that entanglement. Once those provocateurs have done their work, we'll launch into an exercise that will allow all of you to begin to explore different ideas around that using a particular model and framing that Darshan Karwat, one of the provocateurs, has developed in his work. Then once we've done the exercise, then we'll come out and look specifically at you know, the entanglement that's represented by what's happened over the last 5 months, 6 months, with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, what as engineers and as the engineering community we're learning on the basis of our experience over that time that can inform our understanding of the future of engineering. So that's the basic agenda in terms of where we're going to be running into. I will note we've got some mini breaks built into the program. We don't have a formal lunch break. That's a little bit dealing with the time zone differences, whether you're on West Coast time or whether you're on East Coast time. But that probably sets up the situation that there'll be a little bit of the lunch and learn atmosphere to the Zoom session, where some people may be eating their lunch in the background while we proceed with our work. So with that said, we want to take a little bit of time for allowing you to get to know a couple other people that are in the session. We don't have time for everybody to introduce themselves as we would normally do if we were in a formal session with a smaller group. But what we want to do is shift into a breakout mode routine, put you into quads, or there might be 3, 4, 5 people in your group. And in those groups, what we'd like you to do is just take a quick opportunity to introduce yourself to the other members of your breakout group. You might note whether you've been at, you know, previous summits. Are you a veteran or not? And then, you know, in particular, what are your expectations for Summit 9? And have that chat in your breakout groups. And then when you come back to whole group, and Mike will be setting up a timer, We'll give you about 8 minutes to do that work in your breakout group. We'll come back to the whole group, and then I will probably not ask someone from every group, but we'll sample some of the groups to surface what some of those expectations are. So we can kind of have a sense, we know what we have planned, but we're also curious, you know, what expectations you bring with you that, you know, both for today, but also in expectations you can speak to all 4 days that are coming up in terms of the work that we're going to be doing. I will note that, you know, we'll surface those expectations by some of the groups. And here we're just trying to be expeditious with regard to time. But on the other hand, if you can, we would like you to have somebody from your group go into that shared Google Doc. And in that shared Google Doc, if you can just note your own comment or your own expectations at some point. So it's really, you know, just put in you know, whatever you want to say about your document. And then we'll have that shared set of expectations that'll show up as if we were again using a flip chart in the session. All right, with that, Mike, I think we'll try and get people over into breakout. We're going to give you 8 minutes to have those introductions to each other, so you know a few more people that are on the Zoom call, and then as well, you know, talk through your expectations, be ready to come out and report out at least one of those significant expectations that showed up in your conversation to the whole group.
All right, right, we're ready, and I will start the rooms.
All right, are we mostly back, Mike?
We're back.
The only challenge of these kinds of forums is getting booted out of your breakout room.
Sorry about that, Yana. I hit the mute all button, and Kyle, you'll have to unmute too.
Okay. All right. Well,
hey, Mike.
As Yana says, there is a challenge in the breakout room that you may get booted out in the middle of a sentence or word or, you know, this great thing you want to say. So
yeah, I'm used to the countdown, so I managed to fit in almost everything. I was the one talking last.
Okay. Well,
So,
listen,
Mike,
you know, as I said, we're going to be managing time on this. We've got so much material to cover, great provocateurs, and I think the exercise to give you the airtime to explore, you know, the tool that Darshan has set up. So what I want to do is just hear from several. It's sampling, if you will, and then we'll allow other people to both put their expectations into that Google Doc, as many of you already have. That's great that that's working. But also you'll be able to go back and read the expectations that others have set up in terms of a fuller exposition of that. So I'd be curious, group two, you know, what was one of the major, you know, an expectation that someone in your group talked about? And I don't know who was in group two, so if someone there can unmute yourself and offer us your expectation.
Let's see, I'm trying to remember what group I was in. Maybe I was in group two. Yeah, but I know that we had two new members to this summit, and we both heard about wanting to integrate with either associations they had been involved with and Engineering Change Lab, but also diversity, learning about diversity and how to develop that in the profession was also an interest that I heard about as well.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Group five, someone from your group, if you remember which group was up on the window when you were directed over there.
Yeah, I remember because I wrote, and we joked that I started that knowing that this was implicating me as record keeper for the rest of the day. We had a mix of previous attendees and new attendees, and we were all kind of interested in the future of engineering in general and how ECL was going to slot into that. What's the direction of ECL? And a lively discussion around the questions we need to ask, including what's inspiring us right now. So I think it was a fun little chat, and interested in where ECL is going.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Group seven.
I think I'm in the same boat as Chris. I wrote some notes, so now I'm obligated to report out. All right. So our group was dominated by new newcomers to ECL, myself included. And everyone was equally enthusiastic to meet incredibly smart people and discuss important topics, particularly without a mask on, which was really an exciting prospect, as well as expand their own personal thought processes and compare ideas of how to be impactful or how to respond in light of COVID-19. We also had one return member who was eager to continue the dynamic dialogue from past years and continue to gain insights from this group. So he is a good indicator to us that this is a really worthwhile engagement.
Okay, thank you. Group 10. If there's a memory of group 10 in terms of the number.
This is Dave Soka. Yeah,
Hi, Dave.
Hi. Yeah, I think we're particularly interested in taking advantage of really the various backgrounds of people coming from industry, academia, consulting firms, to kind of get their perspectives on the four different aspects. Personally, I'm coming from the engineering society world, and are interested in certainly getting the insights on these areas kind of outside the general scope of my own kind of community.
All right, thank you. And we'll do one more, group 13.
All right, lucky 13, that's me, Amy Squitieri. We didn't know each other, so we took a while to chat and just had about a minute to talk about what we wanted to get out of it. But meeting more people, expanding networks, increasing our innovation, our emotional intelligence around innovation, and opportunity to think big is what we noted.
All right, thank you, Amy. Well, as I say, you know, we're doing everything in a foreshortened manner with regard to time. Thanks for those verbal comments that were offered. As I say, if you haven't yet inside your groups, have somebody, you know, if you can add to that Google Doc list that's been generated by other groups. And when you have a moment, if you know, in any of the groups, if you can just breeze through what was listed there to inform our work, both today, but also over the next 4 days as we have these 4 half-day sessions. In terms of getting to know each other, I also would recommend, I think Mike sent out both a roster, hopefully that you got a copy of, but also there's sort of a online version where you can get a brief bio, capsule resume of each person if you want to have a better idea of who's in the room with us in this Zoom environment. Okay, so appreciate that. Let me go back to a screen share on my part. And just talk briefly about some logistics and ground rules as we go through. You know, most of these you already know, so I'm not going to, you know, hit those. We will try and pay attention to chat, in particular when the provocateurs are speaking. If you have questions that you'd like to raise to the provocateurs, probably the easiest thing would be to go ahead and type your question into the chat. And then Mike or I will come back and be able to moderate that in terms of communicating those questions rather than trying to, you know, catch the eye of somebody on the 3 different screens of participants right now. We will, as I mentioned, we'll be using the dual screen. So we'll take advantage of that. If you aren't, you know, if it turns out you're the recorder in one of the small groups and you aren't able to edit it, you know, you should be able to at least send a notification to me or Joe and Joe. I mean, there's to request permission to edit it, and I'll grant that real quick. That happened with a number of people, but hopefully it looks like most of you were able to do that. As Mike said earlier, from a technical support, if we have trouble, or if you're having any trouble in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of the computers and Zoom, etc., Joe and Joe are holding Mike and I's hands in terms of being able to do this successfully. So you've got their contact information should you need it. Oh, one thing, some of you may want to take your own personal notes in the Google Doc, using it as a workbook. That's great if you want to do that, but if you would, rather than having your personal notes show up in the shared document, if you can just go ahead and download a copy of that as a PDF and then take your personal notes in the PDF off to the side, that would probably be the best way to work that. All right. Any questions about those ground rules or the logistics? Well, if not, then we're going to get started on the with the program itself and the content in terms of this deep dive exploring the entanglement of technology, science, and society. And you know, we wanted to do that by taking advantage of 3 different provocateurs that will offer us views into, or views of that knot, if you will, different views of it. That can begin to get us to think more deeply about what's the nature of that entanglement, and thinking about the future of engineering and how to help raise the potential contribution that engineering can make to society. You know, what do we need to begin to think about what new capacities might we need to begin to develop in order to deal with the type of entanglements that are so characteristic of the world of engineering. So with that, the first person we're going to bring up is Guru Madhavan. Guru is the Norman Augustine Senior Scholar and Director of Programs at the National Academy of Engineering. Those of you that were with us in Houston had an opportunity to hear from and meet Guru at the Houston Summit. So he's making a return engagement with us in terms of provocation. And you know, as I say, the bio is in with the other bios, but Guru has a background in terms of biomedical engineering, an MBA. He's worked you know, both in the profession, but more broadly as a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, and the leadership position that he has with the National Academy of Engineering. All of which, you know, really, you know, we're really pleased that he was able to join us for this session and to offer his perspective about that. So I'm going to close off the screen share that I have and allow Guru to come up and take over.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you, Mike. As Kyle mentioned, this is my second engagement with the summit here. We were at the initiation of the pandemic, and I was coincidentally giving a talk on wicked problems at the previous summit. So as if nothing happened, and in the spirit of full continuity, here we are. I'm going to be talking about the pandemic models that have been bothering me. And I'm pretty sure many of us here in the group. I also want to recognize my colleague, Beth Cady, who first introduced me to the Summit series, and I was instantly captivated by the possibilities, and I'm delighted to be part of the network, or community, shall I say. And I'm also thrilled to be along with Ayana and Darshan. Darshan, thanks especially for your profound paper that's going to set the whole discussion thread for the conference here. So I am here going to be talking about pandemic models, driven by 2 perspectives. First, as a consumer of information, a struggling consumer, and second, as a systems engineer trying to make sense of the entanglement, to borrow Kyle's word. The perspectives that I'm going to say are rooted in some frustration, because I am feeling that the models that are guiding policy, are trying to guide policy, are effectively serving as policy medications that we are using without necessary testing and warning labels. So that's the basic idea. And in a recent opinion piece, I offered that COVID-19 is a collection of emergencies, each with its own tempo and temper. And if you want to take a narrative sense to the problem here, it's a story within a story nested in another. Or in a Hollywood sensibility, it's simultaneously a long-distance relationship story, a war tale, a Greek tragedy, a chase sequence, a love-hate plot, and also a comedy in terms of our gross incapabilities to understand the situations around us. But let's not forget how political this pathogen is and how politically significant this pandemic is. The knowledge about the virus origins seems political. The interventions are political, and the consequences are certainly political and deadly. Practical engineering is also similarly political. But the COVID pandemic, to take us back to the core of my presentation here, has resulted in a buffet of epidemiological models, all you can consume. Whatever their form, the current pandemic models possess some worrisome features, which I'll get into. Some of the more mechanistic models that we have been subjected to use a century-old compartmental approach. They categorize people as susceptible, infected, or recovered. It's a classic model, the SIR model in epidemiology, to track the dynamics of the virus. This particular example, and you can see the date, a few days after the previous summit, and the earliest stages of the pandemic in the United States, 16th March 2020, from the Imperial College, makes the claim, in addition, even if all patients were able to be treated, we predict that there will be in the order of 250,000 deaths in Great Britain and 1.1 to 1.2 million deaths in the United States. We have seen that, and we have experienced the complications associated with these predictions. There are other models that are occupied in doing fantastic aggregation work here. And they've also been coupled with the visually arresting outputs. Of course, these scenarios are depicted in daily news with the stock ticker type precision. However, in a pandemic, duty comes first, beauty next. Similarly, there have been other models that have predicted the spread of the disease that are astonishing feats of statistical tuning and curve fitting. This one particular one from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, also subject to great discussion, publicity, and controversy, has basically capitalized on data from one context redeployed for extrapolation elsewhere. And as you can see, with the kind of projection that says the number of deaths will stop after June 21, and that created a source of great consternation, confusion some weeks ago, as we have all seen. This takes us to the basic point that I want to make in this presentation. The models, especially for pandemic, and I would allow your imagination to expand into many other areas that we have been in before the pandemic, and we are likely to be after the pandemic. How the models are promoted and proliferated without proper reflection about their quality, efficacy, and reliability, with low or no accountability. And as engineers, we take this particular point on about accountability quite seriously, because earlier the foundations of our professional education drill down this point. In fact, the National Society of Professional Engineers Code of Ethics explicitly says that engineers shall, quote, acknowledge their errors, unquote, and, quote, advise their clients or employers when they believe a project will not be successful, period, unquote. So I've compared the responsibility of building scientific models to sitting in, similar to sitting in the exit row of an airplane. One can enjoy the extra legroom of creating imaginative models, but it also comes with the price, being, quote, willing and able to fulfill life-saving duties. So as modelers have used this acronym for a long time, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. I think we need a different acronym, perhaps even a different sensibility. Accountability in, accountability out, or AI, AO. So there are three forms of accountability that I'm going to be discussing today from an engineering perspective that I believe could help professionalize modeling standards. The first one, let's call it effects accountability. And most models often start and end with intents. Pure goal-driven approaches of engineering, no surprise there. What goals should they achieve, under what circumstances, and what trade-offs need to be made. The wider consequences of these models are sometimes just completely ignored, discounted, forgotten. A comparison scenario from the field of medicine would be a clinician prescribing a medication without considering possible side effects, such as interactions with other drugs and the behavioral patterns of the individual. So this is the notion of iatrogenesis, where healing turns into harm. And that's especially relevant here because 5% of hospitalization in the United States results in deaths and comes at a huge cost to society. But 15 years ago, it costed about $1 trillion in social costs. The point here is effects accountability doesn't necessarily mean legal liability, just as iatrogenesis doesn't mean gross negligence or malpractice. Effects accountability is about finger pointing. It's about collective safety and cumulative learning. I'll give you an example from the military context. So you're looking at a taxonomy of an effects-based operation, as the jargon goes, where you have to simultaneously consider what kinds of outcomes are being considered even before the action is being taken. Here, physical, behavioral, and you can read the rest. Unexpected civilian casualties, even degradations in civilian morale, or anyone who's been in a management position knows what any decision that you make could have on the employee morale. So this is the kind of effects-based modeling that we need to bring into high consequence situations here. And I think the idea here is the broader effects of damages, at least an attempt to initially consider them, is going to be important. So that's the goal with the effects-based model, and I think we need to go beyond simply intent-based models. A second type of accountability is explanation-based, which places a premium on the cogency and the usefulness of insights coming from the models. In complex systems such as pandemics, an individual model is weaker. We have known that, and as our engineering practice suggests, an ensemble of models is always better. They produce robustness. One model of models I want to use as an example here was built by NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, when they were trying to investigate the collapse of the World Trade Center after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Between 2002 and 2005, NIST investigators, a lot of engineers, analysts, they blended information from various information sources that included the physical model testing, burn experiments, lab studies, statistical processing, and tons of visual evidence. And they put out like 8 volumes, over 10,000 pages. And the analyses reported on a range of things that you're seeing on the screen here: aircraft impact, fire code, structural steel failure, fire protection system, heat release patterns, emergency response, and ultimately human behavior. The circumstances of the investigation, of the NIST investigation, was clearly nearly impossible because the original conditions of the failure just could not be reproduced. So that's, engineers often find themselves in these kinds of situations here. Instead, what the investigators did was they built a linked set of approximate models that could be separated out for testing and failure analysis. The 9/11 disaster was one of the most photographed disasters in human history. But therein resided the challenge. The investigators got about like 7,000 photos from an original deposit of 10,000. And then they had nearly 100 hours of video clips from many different sources. And this is 2001, so we didn't have the kinds of technologies that we now take for granted. So a lot more integration and quality analysis needed to be done at the time. Now, how do you piece together all these images? Like, for example, this one that you're seeing on the screen here shows a Boeing 767-200 really getting in contact with the second tower here. And it's a scaled outline. showing possible damage patterns if you just remove the aircraft there. And you can see the precision with the wingtip contact with the walls and also the stabilizer interaction there. So this is the kind of retrodiction that is predicting forward in a reverse sequence, which is even mentally challenging that the engineering team had to do at NIST. And you're also seeing the parallel models that were developed. So these are actual samples from the disaster that people pulled out, and they tried to reconstruct something similar and to get to this this state. So really a lot of complication, blending visual evidence and the physical destructive, the destroyed models here. Thousands of images had no timestamps. These were ad hoc photographers, and they were live streaming on TV networks, and some were mistimed because of camera settings. You might imagine when we all had cameras and the dates were different when they appeared in print. And some of these images were delayed mainly because of broadcast timing issues on live TV. So this became a pointillistic exercise where the investigators meticulously constructed a window-by-window profile of the four faces of the Twin Towers. So they looked at a range of effects here to come up with a congruent, cohesive timeline. And then and all these information fed into a global model that you're seeing on the right-hand side here, kind of to show the ensemble view of the damage. So the results of this analysis, of course, it was over a period of years now, and the failure modeling led to design improvements with both skyscrapers and structural steel. So these are high consequences output from the exercise here. So you can see the importance of the role of explanation, or at least the best enough, the good enough explanation for the circumstances. The third type of accountability I'm going to discuss is enterprise accountability. And this stems from really ancient idea that if a pet bites someone, the owner is held responsible. In such cases, the social good derives basically from personal responsibility. And one of the philosophers I've read extensively to get a better understanding of enterprise accountability, as I call it, is Helen Nussbaum. And she uses the gross notion of denial of accountability as it's practiced in the software enterprise. Anyone who uses software or does an app update knows that you have to read through a license agreement that accompanies pretty much any technology that we now use, and that emphasize the developer's rights while negating accountability. And even in my own experience developing software tools, I mean, the company or the organization basically give an all caps disclaimer. These are the sections that we all know are simply not read, just for convenience here. And the example that I want to use where enterprise accountability is taken very seriously in stark contrast to the software industry is the construction industry. I want to use the example of the Brooklyn Bridge that David McCullough has written about in a glorious biography. It's spectacular. And how engineering firms using this specific construction as an example have always used extra precautions to guarantee safety. So the specific issue here is when the caissons for the Brooklyn Bridge were being built in the 1870s, a mysterious disease began affecting the workers. The suspension, for it to work properly, the caissons had to be sunk to the deepest bedrock. We are talking about 80 feet below ground, and to be filled with brick and concrete to provide a firm foundation for these neo-Gothic towers that we enjoy. So returning from the caissons, however, the workers would report severe pain, mostly in the knees. And that proved to be a great mystery. One of the doctors who was working in Brooklyn admitting these workers as patients was Walter Reed, a young Walter Reed, who later gained prominence. But the Kaizen disease, as we have learned over time, or as we experienced during the construction project, created several complications such as convulsions, vomiting, dizziness, double vision. David McCullough writes that when it is severe, local numbness, weakness, and faintness resemble the sickening pain of a blow on the testicle, just to show the effect here. The pain lasted for days and even triggered additional complications. So there was no treatment, so whiskey and ginger was the way to go. Morphine didn't work either. So this remained very perplexing what to do about this. So Washington Roebling, the chief engineer of the Brooklyn, okay, following the footsteps of the legendary original chief engineer John Roebling, wanted to prove a point. He said people can stay longer in the Kaizens, and he himself did it just to boost the morale among the workers, only to suffer the problems himself. So what he did was he installed, thinking it was a smart move, elevators to replace the spiral staircase that the workers used to get out from the great depths. But that only complicated the issue further. People were vomiting even more because of the elevator. It was later.
So Guru, I've got to do this rather. Guru, I've got to do this rather inelegantly since we're not in person and I can't get to the back of the room. Hint more subtly, we're running out of time, so just as a time check here.
I'm wrapping up here. What was clear that this Kaizens disease was basically decompression sickness. Now imagine a modern construction project without a decompression chamber. This is what's called learning from practical experience and institutionalizing knowledge with the essential accountability here. So there's another point that I just wanted to make since we are talking about social impacts. This is the plaque on the Brooklyn Bridge installed in 1991, where the principal acknowledgements are still given to John Roebling and Washington Roebling, but basically no mention to the real engineer in the project. That's Emily Roebling here. And there's a message for engineering here, and that's to hold us accountable. Call it an ethical accountability. Let's not overlook these heroic achievements done by co-workers or unsung heroes. So this is an important professional concept here, because after Washington Roebling fell unconscious in 1872, Emily Roebling had over a period of 4 months learned everything from him, and for a period of 11 years basically supervised the Brooklyn Bridge to completion, while Washington Roebling carried and ultimately got the credit for the chief engineer. So I think we can do better here. My final point here is failures in engineering are judged very unforgivingly, and rightly so. Yet similarly consequential planning models, policy models are rarely held accountable. And I think that's an opportunity for us to reflect on, and as engineers to potentially contribute to the broader issue of gaining better understanding, or as Kyle says, reflect on the entanglements here. So each of the three forms of accountability, effects accountability, explanation accountability, and enterprise accountability, can strengthen our models and approaches for modeling. And this pandemic has only taken lives in the multiples of 9/11, so it's a serious enough situation. Thank you, Kyle, for tolerating my extended conversation here. So I'm done.
Thank you, Guru. As I say, normally if we're in person, I can subtly stand to the side and do a little hand wave or something, but not quite have the same ability to be artful about that. But I do want to, give time checks for that.
It worked. Thank you.
So thanks for being okay with my interruption. So our next provocateur today is Iana Aranda. And Iana is, I think, doing absolutely fascinating work and really important work at, the base is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, where she's director of engineering for global development for that department. But within that context, doing programs and working on strategy for the society and other things. But in particular, she's also president of the Engineering for Change initiative, that has come out of ASME. And Engineering for Change initiative, is doing just fabulous work around the world. I had the chance to sit in on. They have a innovation showcase, which is the principal vehicle for a innovation incubator they put in place, working on technologies for underserved communities around the world. And the work that they're doing there, the number of people that they've got engaged, doing what I can imagine, is just lots of pro bono work, as well as trying to incubate new social enterprises and for-profit enterprises, depending on the situation. Just doing fabulous work. So I'm really pleased to have Iana with us and allow her to offer her thoughts about this entanglement from her perspective. So with that, Iana, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Mike and the rest of the UCL team. And Guru, I'm so inspired by your talk. I'm a big fan, living here in Brooklyn, a big fan of that particular example that you shared, and Emily Roebling herself. So thanks for ensuring to give her the credit that she deserves. I don't know if you saw me, I was clapping on the side. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're doing at ASME and Engineering for Change. And I want to start first by unpacking the forces that are really driving our work and globally what is affecting our reality. So we've talked a lot, or we, I think, have all been exposed to the tremendous technological innovation and advances that have been made over the last millennia. But the reality is that while we are advancing AI and machine learning and other elements, we still struggle in delivering basic services, critical infrastructure, and essential technology to communities around the globe. And the reality is that we still have millions of children dying before the age of 5, billions of people not connected to the grid, and lacking access to safe sanitation, essential technology like the toilet, which I don't think anybody will argue is critical to our well-being. And the current pandemic and, frankly, the bigger disaster that we are all facing as humanity, which is climate change, is only going to exacerbate these issues. We will see that COVID-19 possibly push up to 100 million people into extreme poverty this year. We will see climate change push another 100 million people into poverty by 2030. These are staggering numbers, staggering issues, really wicked challenges for the world to address. The way that we are speaking about these as a global community and the framework for really addressing these issues is embodied in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals that were adopted by heads of state from around the world in 2015 to be met by 2030. Everything from no poverty and zero hunger to clean water and sanitation for all and affordable and clean energy, as well as reduced inequalities and responsible consumption and production. None of these 17 goals can be achieved without the support and the engagement of engineering. And we are all, I think, here and broadly in agreement that technical talent must be prepared to engage effectively in addressing global challenges, both now and in the future, particularly given that as of 2019, when the UN assessed our progress against these 17 goals, and there are a number of indicators associated with each goal, what they determined is that we are not on track to achieve the SDGs by 2030, the timeline. And given the pandemic as it's hit, I assure you that we are even further off track now. So really daunting. When we're talking about technical talent and the need for us to have engineers be active agents in addressing the SDGs and developing solutions, one of the things that is really critical to understand is the fact that that technical talent is unequally distributed around the globe. A few years ago, the Royal Academy of Engineers commissioned a study by the Center of Economics and Business Research to evaluate engineering strength, if you will, within countries. They developed an index, an engineering index that took into account graduates, a part of the workforce, and a number of other parameters to develop this index. And they mapped the entire world's engineering workforce against this index. What they discovered, the impact of engineering, is that it is directly correlated to GDP. A 1% increase in a country's score on its engineering index, in fact, correlates to a 0.85% increase in GDP per capita. This is a significant impact. And what's really critical is to acknowledge that while this is so critical, while this is so important, there are deserts all around the world in terms of engineering talent. For example, the Kenyan Board of Engineers estimates that there are presently about 7,000 to 8,000 engineers in the country, and 700 receive undergraduate engineering degrees annually. But to meet their goals, their sustainable development goals, they really need an engineering workforce of about 20,000 within a decade, really off mark at this time. So it's critical for this workforce to be built up. In parallel, what we're seeing on a global scale is, and particularly in the United States, we're seeing this, is that businesses are spread out. They have supply chains and distribution all around the world, and companies are more and more seeking technical talent that can really work effectively across cultural, ethnic, and national boundaries, and to succeed in this interconnected world. And more, we're seeing that work with purpose is being prioritized by major investors and the current and future workforce. This is a quote from Larry Fink, who's the chairman and chief executive officer of BlackRock. This was a letter to the CEOs of the companies in which BlackRock invests 2 years ago, where he stated that a company cannot achieve long-term profits without embracing purpose and considering the needs of a broad range of stakeholders. BlackRock ultimately also noted that they will start pulling out investments from companies who do not consider and do not demonstrate their social responsibility through their work and their impact. Furthermore, the current largest demographic workforce of millennials and Generation Z are also really impacting and sharing what their perspective is on what needs to be the primary purpose of business, which is improving society instead of generating profit. This was discovered in a study by Deloitte last year. 63% said that should be the primary purpose of business. And 9 out of 10 employees have acknowledged that they're willing to trade a percentage of their lifetime earnings for greater meaning at work. This was a study conducted by Harvard Business Review, or featured in Harvard Business Review 2 years ago. So with all of these forces, this is what catalyzed ASME to really invest in a portfolio related to engineering global development. For those of you who don't know, ASME is a nonprofit membership organization, has been around since the 1880s, around as long as the Brooklyn Bridge, and has a mission to advance engineering for the benefit of humanity. And that core mission is further embodied in the work that we are doing at Engineering Global Development. Our vision is really this world where everyone has safe water, sanitation, energy, food, shelter, information, and infrastructure to live in health, dignity, and prosperity. And our entire focus is on building the capacity of technical talent globally to serve these urgent challenges and deliver sustainable solutions. We do this through a 3-pronged portfolio and program ecosystem that is attracting, developing, and deploying this technical talent and accelerating impactful solutions. Namely, our first pillar is around knowledge and community and engineering for change, which I'll speak to in a minute. Training of social entrepreneurs and practitioners, as embodied in our iShow, and various platforms. And I'll speak to each of these throughout this talk. First, I'm just going to share a little bit about Engineering for Change. For those of you who don't know, Engineering for Change was founded in 2009, over 10 years ago, collaboratively by ASME, IEEE, and Engineers Without Borders USA. To date, Engineering for Change is a digital platform reaching over 1 million people around the globe, engineers, technologists, development practitioners, and social sciences broadly, with information, resources, and opportunities to contribute their expertise through our digital platform. We've been tracking what has been this evolving sector since that time, over 10 years of observing the evolution of this intersection of technology and global development and everything that's been learned. So I'm going to speak to this a little bit broadly. So in 2002, what you see here is an image of Bernard Amadei and when he launched Engineers Without Borders USA. What we were seeing at the beginning of the millennium is a real paradigm shift in how aid was going to be delivered and what it meant to achieve sustainable development. There was beginning of an understanding and a belief that we needed more than aid recipients, that communities in underserved regions, in fact, could be active agents, innovators, entrepreneurs to really advance sustainable development. And engineering was coming into the fold in a more significant way in terms of delivering technology-based solutions to advance this kind of development. It was seen as an enabler to empower and involve people, reduce income inequality, and advance global development. What you see between Engineers Without Borders USA is also an emergence of new technologies such as clean water filters and tablets and others that were really becoming an incredible pathway to improving quality of life. And a growing ecosystem was being developed from key players in industry, academia, social enterprise, NGOs, and multilaterals that was advancing these technology-based solutions, embracing technology as a pathway to improved livelihood and outcomes. And that sector, this is continuing to evolve. In the 10 years, 20 years since this all has kind of started to come together, what you see is a variety of nomenclature descriptions of what this means, whether it's engineering for global development, global engineering, frugal innovation in India, or social innovation more here stateside. The sector continues to grow and evolve, and it's still itself, frankly, emerging. But one fundamental belief that has really risen through the years and continues to be paramount in conversations in these circles is that technology doesn't work on its own. And I will speak to why this belief really exists based on a few key examples that have been shared by practitioners for several decades. So the first comes to us from South Africa. For those of you who are not familiar with, this is a technology that was introduced around 2005, which gained immediate attention and success. This, which you see here, is the play pump. The play pump essentially, and on the schematic on the right, consists of a merry-go-round whereby the hypothesis was that children will play, rotate the merry-go-round, and at the same time use that child energy to pump water into a reservoir, which you see as number 4 here, which is going to then use gravity, have a gravity-fed system that's going to push water into a tap to be collected, typically by women. The gentleman who created the play pump came actually from a marketing background and envisioned a system whereby advertising could be sold to be placed on the top of the reservoir to actually have funding to support the play pump construction. And this was seen as the most innovative, incredible technology. It was featured at the UN. It was immediately gaining tons of attention and tremendous investment from around the globe. In fact, the US government invested about $10 million in the construction of play pumps all around South Africa. And for those of you who are hip hop fans, Jay-Z put in personally $250,000 of his own personal wealth to actually make these play pumps a reality. And they were installed. They were installed all around Africa. And then there was the subsequent follow-up. The same people who reported on the innovation and the opportunity related to these play pumps and drove the funding associated with these play pumps returned to see broken play pumps that were not being used all over African schools. They observed that children weren't playing on the play pumps because, frankly, the amount of playtime available to children in rural African communities is substantially less than that is available to other types of children that were kind of considered more from the urban settings, from really wealthy areas. What they saw was women walking around that merry-go-round and pumping water. And what they also saw was a real lack of understanding of where the aquifers were. Play pumps installed in regions where the aquifers were far too deep or depleted and ineffective at actually delivering water into that reservoir. So what was in effect, the result was that to meet the need of a minimum of 50 liters per person per day of clean water, required children to be playing nonstop for 27 hours every day, 27 hours that don't exist. So in the design of this entire system, there was such a limited view and understanding of both how the communities interact with the water systems, water current, working systems, and really the engineering of these solutions for long-term success. The other thing that was saw was the broken plate pumps were never maintained, were never repaired. They remained these monuments to epic failure in the sector. And we see this broadly, not only in infrastructure like this, but even in the distribution of medical devices such as insecticide-impregnated mosquito nets, which are often distributed free throughout the developing world to fight malaria. So when we look at this intervention on the surface, it seems like such a perfect solution. Distribute the nets, people hang them up, malaria is removed from the equation. What wasn't considered, or what was hard to predict, was some of the unintended consequences of the distribution of these nets through various hospitals throughout the region. What we saw was, as with most things in these contexts, the end of life started to manifest itself over time. Thankfully, most used nets ended up as soccer balls and nets. They were showing up in chicken coops as bridal veils and even funeral shrouds. People were very inventive in how they recycled or upcycled these mosquito nets. But what was more concerning was when those impregnated new nets, and I want to say new because they were more valuable new for fishermen, started to be used. What was observed is that those nets were started to replace the fishing nets because they were free, so much cheaper than buying a fishing net. And that small mesh was really effective at catching fish. So effective that it was catching juvenile fish and actually posing a threat to fishing stocks, as well as that insecticide was coming into waterways and compromising water supplies. And this is also something that manifests itself on a bigger scale with medical devices generally. So one of examples that we captured through our work of a practitioner who was in Uganda visiting a clinic, and he came across one of these bio compartments, which are typically used for managing really dangerous specimens like TB sputum. And he saw this donated piece of equipment in a clinic in Uganda and was surprised that it was quite quiet. Typically, units like this have a fan to actually take away all of the potentially dangerous chemicals. So what turned out to have happened was that the donated compartment was donated without new filters. And in the dusty conditions of the dry season of that Ugandan rural clinic, that filter was immediately clogged up and rendered this bio compartment no longer functional. And this is a story that repeats itself throughout the African context. Without access to electricity, without access to replacement components, donated equipment and refurbished technology from well-meaning private sector organizations, it really enters these markets without consideration for suitability and life cycle costs, which compromise about 80% of all costs of that equipment. There's no consideration for consumables or maintenance. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates that about 80% of the medical equipment in sub-Saharan Africa is currently donated from foreign sources. And 40% of that equipment is unserviced and unusable. There's a term for this in the global health sector. It's medical device graveyards. You see them all over sub-Saharan Africa. And when we're talking about pandemic context like we are right now with COVID-19 upticking all over the continent of Africa, with infections soaring and going to be approaching in the millions shortly, what we've seen as a limited medical equipment, both PPE and essential technologies such as ventilators, are in dire shortage across the country. In South Sudan, for example, 11 million people population, there are more vice presidents than ventilators. So relying on donated equipment is frankly a losing battle in these contexts. And what's really concerning is that the lack of this industrial infrastructure enabling policies and the shortage of technical skills to actually manage equipment is further concerning. Kyle, did you want to give me a time check? I saw that you unmuted.
Yes. Yep.
I'm going to work through it as fast as I humanly can. Forgive me if I speed up. So all of this to say is that the core belief is not unfounded. Technology does not work on its own, but really what has been the lesson learned and what's really critical is that technology can work with the right strategies in place. And in our perspective, what's really the missing link here and what's essential is the building of that technical capacity, reorienting how engineers, technical people are trained to deliver solutions to address these really critical, urgent challenges. What you see here is a process that we developed within Engineering for Change through work with all of our practitioners over the last 10 years that we've been in this space to plan, learn, design, realize, and sustain these technology-based solutions. And what you see here is that circular processes that really demonstrate the iterative nature of developing solutions and the co-creation need for working with communities. The way we've been deploying this work and the way we've been approaching this is through some of our training models, including our research fellowship, bringing interdisciplinary fellows from around the globe who are demonstrating interest in this area, this intersection of engineering and global development, to conduct ecosystem research, identify these insights, really document some of these key issues to be able to deliver this for public consumption through Engineering for Change as knowledge as a public good to distribute more broadly and educate our space. Our cohort this year has over 25 interdisciplinary fellows from every single continent. And what we've seen when we're talking about diversity and inclusion is that the natural outcome of the last 5 years that we've run this program is that this is not architected whatsoever, have seen more women engaging in this space than men. It's just an indicator of the draw that this particular intersection has for engineers around the globe. Nearly 60% of our fellows are women. I'm not going to go too deeply into our research collaborations, but I will speak to the fact that as part of our work, we are also focusing on identifying some of these issues and sharing them on forums that are pertinent to the region where the issues are currently being faced. Our fellows worked to develop background papers on COVID-19 testing and medical devices and PPEs for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, their Innovation and Investment Forum, as well as participating in the Design Bootcamp along with experts from our network. And Kyle, you mentioned the Innovation Showcase. ASME annually runs as part of our Engineering Global Development portfolio, training social entrepreneurs as part of our iShow Accelerator, which happens annually in India, Kenya, and the United States, and where we identify promising hardware-led social innovation to address social and environmental issues and deliver positive results. I'm not going to speak too deeply to our cohort this year, but I will say that one example is Microfuse Technology, where they developed a device that attaches to a cell phone to be able to do a rapid analysis of a retina and identify and diagnose illnesses that impact the retina, like malaria. So identifying those issues early. I'm going to end with an invitation to you all. One of the opportunities we have for you to join is coming up at the end of the year on December 3rd to the 4th. We're going to host our annual Impact Engineered event. This year will be virtual, where we'll be exploring more of these issues broadly with our entire community of social entrepreneurs, multilateral partners, NGOs, and engineering associations. And we really want to offer you the invitation to join us. I'm done, Kyle. I hope not too long. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I welcome questions shortly.
Yeah, I think we'll set aside the questions for right now. I will say, it's just fabulous work that you're doing. I mean, and that the coda, that fundamental belief about technology doesn't work on its own, is a wonderful sort of frame for our work in thinking about that entanglement issue. You can't just do the technology without considering, the larger social system, environmental system, the other things that you talked about that you're addressing in your work. So great job. What we're going to do, we're going to take a short break. We've been going, just short of an hour and a half here. So let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back with our third provocateur, Darshan Karwat. All right. So thank you, everybody. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Let's go ahead and get started. And Darshan, if you want to pull up your slideshow. Darshan Karwat is our third provocateur. And Darshan is an assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, which is within Arizona State University, their engineering school. and is very much involved in a group, interdisciplinary group at the university that's focused on peace, social justice, and environmental protection and engineering. He's got a background in aerospace engineering, sustainability ethics, and those things. Been involved with climate change and other work from that perspective. So really pleased to have Darshan with us. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using some of his work as the foundation for an exercise that we want to use after the provocations to allow all of us to go a little bit deeper in terms of exploring this entanglement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darshan.
Awesome. I hope all of you can see and hear me well. Thank you, first of all, to Kyle and Mark for creating this space. I'm quite grateful for what you're doing here. Guru, I love the way you think, and Yana's remarks are in many ways synergistic with mine. I do not have to go back home to Mumbai, India to find technological inequality and its interplay with poverty, environmental injustice, and marginalization. I simply have to walk the streets of Phoenix, where many still have inadequate access to energy services in the hotter and hotter desert summer, or San Francisco, where the tech fuel gentrification and rising poverty have shocked even the UN's poverty expert, or Detroit, whose planning and cars help not only create the American middle class, but also urban sprawl and inertia for mitigating climate change, or even Hale County in the Black Belt of Alabama, where even today, vast swaths of homes aren't even built to code. So the legacy of engineering for me is not only full of awe-inspiring achievements like refrigeration, lasers, computing, and getting to the moon, but it is also full of mountaintop removal and poisoned waters, the continued development of the capacity to destroy life and the earth. While these are certainly issues of social policy, they are also issues of engineering, technology, and science policy. They are issues of what we consider to invest in technically. I'll go further and say that they are also issues about how we as engineers justify to ourselves the work that we do. It is about our stake in the world that we build. Now, many blame politicians, governments, and markets for the technically driven problems the world faces. You can think about war, climate change, surveillance, disinformation, and on and on. But why is it that there are almost always engineers and corporations willing to design and build the technologies that cause those problems, many times in spite of knowing about the negative consequences of those technologies? As an aerospace engineer, I care deeply about engineering. As a human, I care about what engineering means to society and the earth. And so I entered this space by using the lens of activist engineering, which is something that I started thinking about a few years ago, and something that I'll describe throughout my remarks. I'm grateful that the Engineering Change Lab again has created a space for engaging such. Today, it is around two main points which I raise questions about engineering. First, given that engineering is a political enterprise as much as it is a technological one, engineers and their employers can do a much better job at making the values they bring to their work more explicit. That can help them better understand the implications, positive, negative, and unintended, of their work. And second, I believe that we can engage in creating new possibilities and opportunities supported by new financial models for engineers who want to promote the values of environmental protection, social justice, and peace. Not a single technology exists outside of the entanglement that Kyle has described, even one being designed in a lab and a decade away from being put out into the world. But engineers tend to recast the seamless web of the technical, social, environmental, and political aspects of a technology into isolated spheres in which there is the political on the one hand and the technical on the other. And that happens through a variety of mechanisms, like the division of labor, through the conceptualizing of technical as fact, and the political and non-technical as value. Now, many engineers actually go one step further. They tend to frame any non-technical concerns, such as social justice or peace, as irrelevant to real engineering work. A great example of this is interest in expanding the US. This quote motivated motivated my lab's work on thinking about the social responsibility of engineers and impacts of border walls on wildlife. He said, there could be a political backlash, but we are in business to make money and put people to work and provide a good service, whether it's a wall or a substation or airport or prison. We don't want to approach it from a political standpoint, only from a business standpoint. Sorry, I'm having technical issues here.
Yeah, Darshan, there's a little bit of static and cutting in and out on your audio.
Hey, Darshan, I just sent you a private message, but perhaps stop your video stream while you talk. That might allow your audio to improve with the bandwidth.
Okay. Let me just get to the next slide and that should be good. Okay. Can everybody hear me well?
Yes, you're
Now
sounding.
we can.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we know that engineering is political. Engineered systems reflect our values as individuals, firms, and economies. Implicated in political issues like election security, disinformation, and climate change are technologies, cyber technologies, deep fakes, fossil fuel technology, and so on. And by extension, implicated in all of these issues is our work as engineers. Our nation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is no different. Our scientific and technological responses to it are seamlessly political. And the virus is making its way through a complex world of politics, policies, logistics, and economic structures, all of which have been shaped by the design of technological systems, which again, by extension, have been shaped by engineers. So what values do we bring as engineers to our responses to the pandemic? And for those of you who think about environmental challenges, what does it mean for engineering that the impacts of a virus on our economies have produced cleaner skies all over the world than any technological system itself? The idea of activist engineering can help here. Activist engineering is about having engineers make explicit the values and key drivers of why engineering is done, and having that knowledge shape how engineering is done. So activist engineering is about fundamentally redefining the contemporary engineering practice by exposing the political and value-based nature of it, by applying social and ecological learning to technological design, and by imbuing a different sense of responsibility of engineers to move the scope of engineering beyond solely technological development. So the goal in the end of activist engineering, in my mind, is to get engineers to ask and have a conversation about the question, what is the real problem that we're trying to address? And does this problem actually require an engineering solution? Now, if an engineer can ask this question, that means they can confidently ask this question and they have the tools to answer it. And perhaps answering this question allows engineers to have more of a vested stake in the system that they're involved in designing. Broadly deployed technologies and systems shape society by creating markets, regulatory frameworks, and jobs. Each generation is born into different worlds with different possibilities, expectations, and dependencies, all shaped by engineering design. Let's take the case of electricity and electrical systems. The life of someone born in the 1800s, long before the grid was even imagined, was fundamentally different than someone born just 2 decades ago. We now live our lives, at least within the United States, assuming that the electricity will flow at any moment that we want. Now that is policy. That said then, when our technologies are involved in humanitarian crises, as say Raytheon weapons are in Yemen, is it okay to say, as the Raytheon CEO did, that, quote, we are an element of US policy. Our role is not to make policy, our role is to comply with it. Now, I'm unsure what engineering leadership actually means if engineering's role is to simply comply with policy. Given the grand power of engineering, shouldn't leadership help out engineers think about the possibilities of peace, of violence, of environmental protection or destruction we are creating through our work? If, as engineers and corporations, we consciously didn't create sophisticated weapons and bombs, politicians wouldn't be able to order them dropped. So might it be possible then that a more peaceful world actually has fewer weapons in it? And what does that mean for engineering? Basically, we live in a world with a lot of inequality and injustice, and unconsciously or otherwise, it's a world that engineers have helped create. And so it's entirely reasonable to imagine engineering done to directly reduce inequality, injustice, suffering, and violence in many ways that Jana has already described. Now, this is the opposite of the kind of engineering where the benefits of our work trickle down to those, including non-humans, who need it most. So how do engineers push to make a more peaceful, greener, and just future possible? We engineers can help create, from philosophy to practice, an economy that supports such engineering. We can't leave it to politicians or lawyers or business people who benefit from the way in which technological systems are currently being designed. And there's a lot of history to learn from here. So for example, the March 4th movement. Engineers in the past have struggled with these very issues. In the height of the anti-Vietnam War ferment in 1969, the MIT Fluid Mechanics Laboratory, which at the time included 3 full professors, 3 assistant professors, a support staff, and about 20 graduate students, this entire lab underwent a complete transformation. Its entire focus changed from fluids research for military purposes to 4 other fields: air pollution, water pollution, biomedicine, and desalination. Many more too have done their best to break this link between their work and the ability to simply harm other people. If you can see it, you can change it. In 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, a nonprofit called SkyTruth, which was founded by a geologist who used to work in the oil and gas exploration sector, questioned BP's and the government's estimates of how much oil was being pumped into the ocean. They did that by analyzing NASA MODIS and advanced land imager data. They found that the flow rate of the spill was being significantly underreported by up to a factor of 20. That analysis put SkyTruth in the spotlight, and since then, they've developed the tools to use data from satellites to monitor threats to the planet's natural resources, threats like urban sprawl, fracking, mountaintop removal, and overfishing. Their goal is to not just report on disasters, but to inspire a global movement where everyone can easily access technological resources and be motivated to protect the planet from future catastrophes. How do disparities in health, education, and access to resources affect the dynamics of economic and social systems that lead to conflict? Or how do sudden population changes, like those that occur in disasters like hurricanes or armed conflict, put pressure on technological systems in communities that absorb that population? We can see that in the very framing of these kinds of questions, Drexel University's Peace Engineering program is experimenting with how engineering tools and approaches, when deployed with a singular goal in mind, creating the conditions of peace and reducing the possibilities of violent conflict, can help us be prepared for turbulence in a climate-changed world. In my mind, programs like Peace Engineering at Drexel expand the definition of what engineering can be. Think about Flint, think about Appalachia, or most any industrial facility in the United States. You can think about poor communities living around petrochemical refineries and incinerators, or even communities living around toxic Superfund sites across the United States. There are so many spaces in the United States where, because of regulatory challenges, a lack of socioeconomic resources, or a lack of political power, communities face unending and disproportionate environmental burdens of technological activity. Project Confluence, one of the main projects in my lab group, begins with the recognition that many communities across the United States face environmental, climate, and energy challenges, and that these communities could benefit from thoughtful collaborations with engineers. So how might we mobilize engineers to address these challenges, recognizing that while helping one community is great, there are dozens, even hundreds of other communities across the United States that are facing similar challenges? So we're developing the tools, the online collaboration platforms, and the processes to facilitate fruitful collaborations with engineers at any and all stages of their careers, and in a way where engineering projects are scoped to address the needs of multiple communities at the same time. We've actually already identified hundreds of practicing engineers across the United States who want to engage. From these examples, I hope you can see that there are experiments going on and networks being built to promote environmental protection, justice, and peace through engineering. But in my mind, a lot of this work is at too small a scale and is still a little too slow. Practicing and new engineers need to demand a much wider range of options for engaging in society and earning a living than currently available. Schools are doing a better and better job at educating engineers in systems thinking and human-centered design, in thinking about environmental impacts and social responsibility in engineering. But go to any career fair on a college campus, and a vast majority of the employers you see are ones recruiting for jobs with descriptions that could have been written 30 years ago. So in my mind, I think there is something structurally wrong here. What can we do for those who want a rewarding engineering career by employing their technical skills in direct service of community? I don't think we can expect everyone to be entrepreneurs.
Darshan, I'm going to give you your time check here.
All right. We also can't forget that most of the engineers in the world aren't in school. They're out in the working world and they have a mortgage and their children's college educations to pay for. A quick online search shows how many practicing engineers are in fact dissatisfied with the work that they do. A lot of engineering jobs can take creative and talented people and turn them into cogs in vast bureaucratic machines with little sense of purpose. A few years ago, when I arrived as an intern at GE Aviation in Ohio, I found engineers in basement cubicle farms as far as my eyes could see. Walking through the farm, I had never seen a bigger group of grumpy old men in my life. One of them told me, "Son, I just spent the last 20 years of my life down here. You shouldn't." Engineering work that promotes environmental protection, social justice, and peace cannot be relegated only to volunteer efforts or those that are part of corporate social responsibility plans. Rather, new financial models need to be created to make this work more sustainable and vibrant, and a viable option for people at all levels of their career to make a living wage. That can demonstrate how engineers can be a part of addressing social challenges at the scale they need to be addressed. Now, lastly, to support these kinds of ideas, I think just like this Engineering Ideas Institute is, we can create more spaces in our places of work to have more vigorous debate on what engineering is for, to make the philosophy of activist engineering more practical, and to encourage engineers to think expansively about the impacts of their work and the kinds of problems that engineering can and cannot address. I've created a list of questions, and engineers can reflect on these questions related to the social, political, environmental, ecological, peace, and security considerations about one's engineering work. The list also has questions about addressing personal conflicts, alternative problem-solving approaches, and incorporating feedback in engineering work. And I'm happy to share that list with you, and it's something that we've adapted, as Kyle mentioned, for our exercise a little bit later. Maybe what I'm saying challenges the fundamental values and principles that guide technological and scientific investments in the United States and the history of an engineering professionalization. But the world that we live in has in no small part been created by engineers, and engineers will continue to dictate the design and development of technologies that shape human relationship to the earth and its people. So to infuse the engineer with ideals of justice, with practical tools to understand the impact of their work on people and the earth, and with the ability to work intimately with those who have different kinds of knowledge, is to change the world. And I would love to work with any one of you on this project, so please let me know. With that, I leave you with 3 questions I think all engineers should think about. Why are we engineers? For whose benefit do we work? And what is the full measure of our moral and social responsibility?
Great, thank you, Darshan. Great questions. And you know, that notion of that you're ending with of seeing the relationship between the engineering product, what we produce, but between the engineers themselves and, you know, the values sets that we have versus, you know, the world that we're part of is a terrific sort of, you know, setup for the exercise that we want to move to. So let me just open up if there are a couple questions or burning sort of thoughts that, you know, participants want to surface and engage with the provocateurs. Just open up some, just a little bit of space for that. You can either speak up or you can raise your hand in the participant menu.
Darshan, this is Darshan, this is Clint Robinson. I have a question for you because along the lines of your discussion elements, one of the things that's troubled me about engineering, and I think Guru hit on it in Houston for us, was this a notion that everyone sees an engineered solution differently. And I believe Guru showed the different forms of an airplane. If an airplane was viewed by as a structural engineer, it would show a bunch of steel members instead of the aircraft itself. One of my concerns is that as engineers, we don't think about things holistically. We think of things as a solution set in a box and we're done. So I'm curious your opinions on how holistically, with regard to the availability of resources and or the impact of those resources when we're done with the element, i.e. Lithium batteries. Do we have enough lithium to generate enough battery storage for everyone in the country? And when we're done with that battery storage, can we recharge the lithium on the back end? Tell me what your philosophy is on looking at engineering solutions holistically versus solution driven.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I mean, I think that we have a very good ability to work on quote unquote solutions, depending on, or in many ways, regardless of the bounds that are being drawn around a technological system. In many ways, I feel like the ways in which we conceptualize engineering problems, as you were saying, are very bounded. And I think that it is entirely reasonable to expect that we expand the bounds of our impact, or expand the bounds of our thinking to consider different kinds or larger scale impacts. And with those new kinds of bounds, I think that engineers in many ways can address problems under those expanded bounds. It's simply a matter of extending our gaze as engineers about what the impact of our technologies actually are. I think that in the example that Yana raised about play pumps, that's a fabulous example about not extending our gaze in ways that ought to be extended. If the right kind of survey work was done in that context with how communities in South Africa actually live, engineers could have designed a better system that wouldn't lead to the technologies being abandoned, right? So I think it's more a matter of acknowledging that we need to extend our gaze. And once we do extend our gaze about the ways in which we can, or the factors that we take into our engineering work, we can do amazing engineering work. So I think it's just simply a matter of extending the bounds of what we consider influencing our design. And once we set those bounds, we can do a good job.
I just want to add to what you're saying, Darshan, and I'm in violent agreement with everything that you noted. So I think, Clinton, one thing that we want to also highlight is that there are already some tools and frameworks available that we can apply, that this is not something that we necessarily totally built from scratch. Methodologies like human-centered design actually challenge us and provide engineers the tools, and we advocate for those in Engineering for Change through our educational curriculum, really challenge us to understand what are requirements versus needs. How do you really ask the right question? How do you ensure that you're actually framing the problem correctly and that we're not limiting our own scope of view? There's also tools within the realm of social science, like PESTLE analysis, which is a framework by which you integrate political, economic, social considerations, as well as technological, when you're defining, your problem or right at the beginning. So the root is really where we need to start rethinking, how do we as engineers define the problem in a way that's ultimately going to yield us sustainable solutions, right? That allows us to consider all of these various factors. It's not a trivial feat, but it is, there's available tools that we can leverage already. And that's really what's, I think, exciting and promising.
And I think to build off of that, just in the end, we do have to define bounds around what we do. And so there are going to be social and environmental impacts that we cannot consider or that make it exorbitantly expensive to consider. I think acknowledging that upfront is crucial. I think many times when we think about renewable energy technologies, for example, we actually aren't really thinking about the ways in which people in China are affected by the manufacture of renewable energy technologies, right? We think that they're good here, but we're not thinking about people over there, right? And if we did consider the impacts of these technologies on people over there, maybe our designs would be different, right? And so simply acknowledging that, I think, is crucial.
I'm sorry, or the last build on that, you raised such a good point, Darshan, that I think one of the ways that we can do this and kind of acknowledging our own limitations means that we also recognize that we can't do it alone. One of the things that we advocate for in our work is multidisciplinary engagement. And the future of engineering, frankly, has to be multidisciplinary. Engineers need to step out of this idea that we have the answer, that we can figure it out if we just sit in our little cubicle in the basement, like Darshan you described, and we solution it on a piece of paper. That's not going to work. We need to really equip engineers to be able to reach across the aisle to understand that there's a role for a social scientist, a development practitioner, a public health person, a political scientist to come into the conversation and help us understand what we don't know and provide those lenses, provide those insights that we so desperately need to be able to arrive at the right boundary conditions and actually answer the right needs for the communities that we are serving. Okay, I'll shut up now because this question was directed at Darshan.
So just as a follow-on to that, Bill Stout raises a follow-on question, really, which is, how do we extend that same, or how do we convince our clients or the customers of the technology to go with us in that extension of the view of the problem and the bigger, the set of relationships that surround it? It's not just us. We've got to, there's that, if you will, the leadership component to it as well. Any thoughts about that, either of you, or Guru as well?
I was just going to add a minor point to Ayana's point and Darshan's deep provocation. What is engineering for? Which kind of ties into your question here, Kyle. And I've been increasingly concerned, confused is a better word, about what systems engineering or systems thinking should be. I have colleagues who I work with closely who have their own conception of what systems thinking or human-centered design, call it whatever, is or should be. Some of my colleagues are completely comfortable taking ratios and calling that the systems approach, legitimately so. Even the idea of GDP, I mean, we might immediately dismiss it as an anti-systems approach, but the output of that calculation, whether it comes from the field of economics or a bank, affects a system, has the propensity to affect the system. So I think as we think about this, and I think the unifying theme in our provocations, as I've derived it, is the systemic approach. Darshan's, yours is political, and Ayana, you talked about more humanitarian ground level works in a gross simplification of mine. I think what should systems engineering be? Or I'm using this in a more holistic construct here. So I don't have a direct answer to your question, Kyle. I think we have to think about it. But I just wanted to add this point because we seem to justify our approaches as the approach, and we seem completely comfortable with
All right. Well, I'm gonna move us along here and just for a moment, thank all of you for the great, all three of you for the great start in terms of those provocations. They set up not only the work in the remainder of today with regard to technological driving forces and this entanglement we're exploring, but they also, I think, really set up the conversations that we're going to proceed to have in the next 3 days, both tomorrow and Wednesday, Thursday of next week, as we look at the other elements of the program that we've got. So thank you for those provocations. What I want to do is very quickly set up the exercise that we want to go to. We'll have about a 10-minute break in between that setup and when we actually get people into the breakout groups to do that work. So let me just pull up my screen for a moment and give you some basics in terms of the exercise. Darshan's going to join me shortly to talk specifically about the framework and tool that he's developed that we're capturing and using in this exercise, and then we'll turn you loose for that short break. So just in terms of the introduction to this, and it really builds on exactly what what Guru just said about systems thinking or the systems approach. And I think what's embedded in all 3 provocations this morning, we have heard consistently over the 8 ECL summits leading up to this one, the importance of systems thinking as a key capacity for engineers to have in order to be able to reach that highest level of contribution that we aspire to. In our thinking about the mission for engineers in the Change Lab, and that to develop that systems thinking, that capacity for doing it, I would offer that it's going to require some shifts of mind. This was work that a co-author Susan Harris and I did in a book a number of years ago, looking at the future of the engineering profession from the eyes of thinking about consulting engineering and other design professionals. But we articulated there the need for particular shifts of mind from, the design professionals or the engineers focusing on parts and pieces to having that systems awareness, from an organization focus to a social system awareness, from a human-centered focus to a whole ecosystems focus. You can't just see what is it about the human and the person. We've got to see the larger ecosystem and environment around it. And even from seeing, just our technological piece that we're dealing with, to seeing, how that technology sits in the much larger whole value network, what we were calling it, but the larger technological network that it's part of. So there's that shift of mindset that I think is captured, that is, one of the things for unlocking that higher potential in the future of engineering. That's expressed really, I think, in that diagram down below, where technology, what typically the engineers are working to apply technology to solve problems inside that intersection. Without that larger awareness, without that larger connection and relationship to the social system, the environmental system, those larger systems around it. And so, the work that we wanted to do today in exploring the entanglement is just to, again, push on that boundary that says, engineers, if you're going to unknot that entanglement, or find a way to at least cope with the entanglement that is by nature, is of the nature of our work, we need to build those capacities to be more aware. And so one of the ways that we can get at that, we felt, was some work that Darshan had been doing, and a framework and tool that he offered as a way of using reflection and questions to get at this notion of an awareness of the larger systems that surround our work. So Darshan, do you want to just give a quick introduction to that concept and what you were doing there, and then I'll lay out the directions for the exercise.
Sure, absolutely. I won't take too much of your time, but basically, as I ended my talk, right, there were 3 questions that I feel like engineers ought to reflect on, right? Why am I an engineer? For whose benefit do I work? And what is the full measure of my moral and social responsibility? And these questions are at some level seemingly simple, but I think as Kyle has discussed, the entanglement actually complicates these questions. And so I felt like it was important to break down these questions a bit. And the paper that I wrote, Self-Reflection for Activist Engineering, and I'm happy to share that paper with anybody, I provide a list of questions that any engineer can use, any leader can use, for self-reflection to better understand their own motivations for why they're doing what they're doing, and to just better understand the implications of what they're doing. The questions that I pose build off of research in the history and philosophy of engineering, engineering ethics and education, and current events. And I should say that I chose the idea of self-reflection as a mechanism into thinking about the impacts of engineering work, because I think that as humans, we self-reflect all the time, right? You can have your child at the age of 2 ask you a very simple question that makes you think about something in a reflective manner. Somebody's home might be destroyed by a hurricane, and that makes you reflect on one's life. Self-reflection is a part of religious traditions, right? Catholics confess and Buddhists are mindful. And self-reflection is a part of social programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So the idea of self-reflection about who we are and why we do what we do, I think is widespread and in many ways universal. And so, you know, I think about self-reflection as simply an analysis of one's beliefs, actions, and outcomes of those actions. I couldn't find in the literature any attempt at making a list of questions that could help engineers self-reflect, and specifically a list of questions that any engineer, regardless of what stage of their career they're at, could use. And so the paper that I wrote is a small attempt at filling that gap. And I think in the end, the questions are simply jumping off points for self-reflection. They're not to be considered an end-all be-all set of questions, but rather just an entry point into thinking about engineering and impact on society. The last thing that I'll say is that I created the list with input from engineers across the sectoral space, so from academia, government, the private sector, as well as engineering students. And I think that in the end, answering these questions, which as you will see, there's only a subsection of them here, and actually they're slightly modified for this particular audience. It's hard to answer these questions, and I do not expect, nobody should expect any single engineer to be able to answer all of these questions. But I think that even partially answering some of these questions can help it make acceptable that it is okay to ask critical questions about engineering. It can help engineers understand how engineering is implicated in many of the problems that we now as engineers are trying to solve. It can give some meat to bones, like concepts like public welfare and sustainability. And I think in the end, most importantly, it can help build a community of like-minded engineers to act on I think a lot of what engineers hold in themselves. There's a lot of conflicts that I feel like engineers have with the work that they do. And this is simply a way in which to act on that conflict and create a community in which they can actually share their thoughts a little bit more safely.
All right. Thanks, Darshan. So let me give you the exercise and the list of questions that you're going to be using in this. Instead of just self-reflection, it will be reflection of a small group in terms of doing this. So if you looked in, if you went to that Google Doc, and I've got it up on the screen here, what we're going to do is put people into small groups. Now, in those small groups, we want you to assume a role. And the role is that you are all members of an engineering team responsible for innovating or developing the next generation of a selected technology. Your task is to explore the entanglement that we've been talking about this morning, or that larger systems awareness between your technology and the social and environmental systems within which it is nested. by reflecting as a group on those questions that we're going to give you. So you're to have that conversation as if you were all members of that engineering design team responsible for the next generation of that technology. Now, when you get into your small groups, we'd like you to, one, quickly introduce yourself so you make sure you know who's in the group. From a procedural standpoint, it's helpful to have some roles. There will be a discussion leader. Now, in this case, for the first exercise we're doing as part of the 4-day effort here, we've designated some discussion leaders out of people in the steering group just to accelerate things. In future, we won't do that. Have somebody play recorder in the Google Doc like you've been doing, and then somebody that's prepped to be the presenter in terms of offering thoughts from your group to the whole group. It's always nice to know you're going to be the presenter before the exercise starts rather than at the end. You'll think a little bit differently. Now, the notion is when you get into that small group, if you're going to be this engineering team responsible for innovating this technology, what technology are you going to be talking about? Now, in this case, again, to accelerate things, we've given you some possible selections, and each group has a different set. Now, some of those selections, as shown on this page, are what I could characterize as emerging technologies, robotics or nanotechnology or facial recognition. And we've given you a definition of those if you want to use one of those emerging technologies just to help get everybody on the same page to start with. Or instead of using an emerging technology, you could use a conventional technology as this and innovate that, whether it's something like agricultural irrigation systems or tasers or medical ventilators. Or if you aren't satisfied with those choices, and if someone feels quite passionate about a particular technology, you can choose one of your own. So after your introductions, the first step is really to choose the technology you want to use as the basis of having this conversation and this reflection. I think it will also be helpful once you've chosen the technology to just very quickly identify what type of organizational context your team is within. Are you a team within a consulting engineering company, within an industrial manufacturing company, a tech company, biotech, academic innovation incubator, or some other setting? But just have a little bit of context for that. Again, both in terms of choosing the emerging or choosing a technology and an organizational context, exercise your choice fairly quickly. This is not a life choice. It's just setting up the exercise. So if you can do that fairly quickly, the really interesting part will come when you move into the exercise itself. So choose a technology, organizational setting, and then what we want you to do is take about 25 minutes to have that conversation using the questions that are shown on page 16 here. This is for the first group that are drawn from Darshan's article or his essay. Now, as he says, he slightly adapted them for purposes of our exercise. I'm not going to narrate them, but you can kind of see they go from, questions about the social and political considerations to the environmental, ecological considerations to other connections and feedbacks and possible potential personal conflicts. Have that conversation, and then after that 25 minutes or the period of conversation, we'd like you to have some summary discussions. And you can field, are there potential insights or leverage points when you think about that technology you were dealing with? But that's the less important thing we want you to get out of the conversation. Mostly we want you to focus on those last 2 bullet points in step 3. What did you notice as you and your team engaged in this type of reflective practice? And what benefits could you see or can you see for this type of inquiry being more deeply embedded in engineering practice? So we'd like you to, really be prepared to report out your thoughts about those last 2 bullet points when you come back to the whole group. Once again, in the workbook, what we've set up is that there are pages that we're going to divide you into 8 groups. There are separate sets of pages for each group. And as I said, each group has a slightly different set of technology choices, just for some variety. So that's the basics. You've got, 5 minutes to do your group charter, make your choices with regard to technology and context, 25 minutes for your reflective conversation, answering those questions. And you may not get through all the questions, that's okay. But do try and not just get stuck on the first one. Try and move through, sample a number of them. And then have that summary discussion towards the end of your work. All right, so thanks for everyone just sort of sampling, looking in on each of the groups. Really appreciated your timeliness in terms of getting through to the summary discussion and able to have that conversation. What I want to do in the report, we'll do it fairly quick, is just turn to each of the groups and have you quickly maybe share one or two observations that came up in that summary discussion in terms of using this idea of self-reflection or reflection as a group to inquire beyond the bounds perhaps that engineers typically do, looking at those larger systems that Darshan has laid out in his questions there. So I'm going to share my screen, and then what I'll do is I'll scroll down to the work from each of the groups that your presenter can talk through, and I'll try and be at the right page with the presenter. So group one, I don't know who your presenter is, but go for it.
Unmute myself. Well, we chose robotics as emerging technology, and the benefits for robotics are really pretty evident, because robots can take over very process-oriented tasks and can also do things in much more safe and efficient environment. So those tasks can be handled, and then workers can be offered other kinds of jobs to do. Now, one thing that we immediately focused on the impact of jobs, and that replacing a workforce is actually a displacement. So there is, we came to the point that shared knowledge or shared understanding of these kinds of displacements are actually a responsibility, maybe not as our industrial company on its own, but a collective of the industry in general, and probably the profession as well, to help the industry, to help the workforce to reposition and retrain. We're going to need people to service those robots, so that's very important. We're also going to need to be very outspoken about the benefits, so that the public understands that we're not displacing jobs, but in fact we are improving safety and efficiency. And as a group, we would have the opportunity to engage in retraining and working with education sources, K through 12 and higher education, to train that workforce in the future. The vision that we developed is to replace high hazard and unsafe jobs with robotics. The ethical implications of reducing workforce and impacting the environment will need to be mitigated, but do certainly not outweigh the benefits. One of the insights was that we all quickly agreed that we have a social responsibility, even though the technology can outpace that social response.
All right, thank you, Rick. Good report. Next group, and again, in these reports, if you can try and target, at most a couple minutes in terms of your report, so that we can get through these and have some general discussion. So thanks. Group two.
For my benefit, any chance to make the script a little larger?
Sure.
I'm from the senior group, and my eyes are getting.
Gary, you're reporting for group two, Gary Raba.
Got it. I just unmuted myself, I think.
Does that work better? And I'll try and do that for each of the groups.
A little more would be beneficial for me, please.
All right.
Can you zoom in on the whole thing?
Oh, can I zoom in on it? Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
'Cause
probably.
I can't read it either.
Yeah, just maximize.
Yeah, it isn't a function of your font size, it's a function of your view.
Yeah, you might want to hold down Control and use your scroll key, and it should zoom.
Since he's using a Mac,
I tell you what,
just
let
need
me try and do that, and who's ever reporting, if you can go ahead and report, I'll try and figure out how to do this.
Well, if it's a
Well,
Mac,
up on
it'll
your-
require like 14 keys.
Up on your menu bar, you had a little thing and it says 100%. If you click on that, you can enlarge it.
Okay.
And I
The,
would
the window itself could be maximized though.
There, yay. Okay.
using 60%.
Yeah, and also you can hit the little green dot up at the top and make it fill the screen. Way up at upper left.
One more thing I would just tell the group, if you have access to the Google Doc, you can pull this up on your own. Everybody's viewing the same live document with all these
Right.
changes if it helps anybody individually. Thanks.
Right, thank you. All right, group 2.
All right. This is Gary. For group 2, we had our choices between the VR, the AI, machine learning, as well as synthetic biology. And we did a really good job of combining all of them and taking the standpoint from the AI, machine learning, and to some degree, the biology part of it, into from a medical standpoint of how we could use the AI and machine learning in the medical field so that we're able to reach across a broader spectrum of locations, as well as a broader case for the potential patients and the people in need. Some of the things that we talked about, the political considerations, are obviously the scalability. We need to get beyond the broadband issues that we have in some of our remote areas. But some of the other political considerations is how it can broaden the employment of different learned professionals, not just an MD, but others that are trained for medical purposes to be able to assist from the robotic standpoint. The concerns that we had with respect to some of these, the constraints, were that everything, I think I'm saying this rightly, everything that's programmed is coming from the human that's programming that has an inherent biasness within themselves. So until we're able to foster some type of AI that is a learning AI, the biases may still be inherent within the delivery of the services. The environmental ecological considerations, we talked about really low carbon. You're talking about less transportation, you're talking about less transmission, diseases, potential cases in a smaller setting, fewer dispersed resources. Could also be an impact to that, as well as increase efficiency of the diagnostics for the patient in all. Praxis connections, feedbacks, number of, obviously the biggest roadblocks are going to be the possessiveness that the insurance companies and some of the other pharmaceutical companies have with respect to the delivery and the pricing of their services. The medical profession is going to be a big resistance to that. So there are a number of embedded opponents that will be have to be addressed. But you're also talking about some of the things, the negative things that you're talking about with respect to the loss of humanity in that, and how do we overcome that human touch? If somebody says they don't want to be told by a robotic or machine learned machine that they've got cancer. The thinking, the insights, what was kind of interesting is nobody on our team was in the medical profession, nobody was in the AI profession, nobody was in machine learning. And so when you're talking about stuff that you really don't have a preconceived idea of what the hell the answer is, it's really easy to be broad and be strategic in thinking and not leap ahead and continue the blue sky.
All right, thanks, Gary. Okay, so with group 3, what I want to do is I want to speed you along. Again, you know, in your report, if you can mostly focus in on the summary discussion, you can talk about which technology you use, but for the reports right now, if you can focus on the summary discussion as opposed to the detail in terms of insights you might have had about that the particular technology, then I think we'll be able to touch base with each group. We've got to do that. This is going to be the lightning round of reports on this. So group 3, lightning round, go for it.
Here we go. We were looking at high-tech construction, advanced materials, from the point of view of a consulting engineering company, since most of us are in that realm. I think, what we came down to was a greater appreciation for stakeholders and the end user. We were looking at, for instance, using 3D printing to generate housing. And, were the people willing to live in these types of houses that we're generating, or is it we creating a Cape Cod for people who are used to living in ranches or whatever, and they wouldn't socially accept that. So we look at working with the users to help define the problem. We had some discussion of the formation of young people's opinion groups in each companies to kind of give a different point of view. They certainly have a different point of view than most of us baby boomers. So part of the diversity of the company is to look at it from different points of view. We also have to deal with the harsh realities of budgets and time constraints. So you try and be introspective and you try and work with stakeholders, but there is a time frame that has to be done, and it's only so much budget maybe to deal with some of that, and looking at various alternatives. Like I said, hurrying through the projects does not allow for altruistic reflections all the time. One of the comments in the reading was, we go from project to project and we don't always get feedback either from the clients or superiors on how well we did. We're talking about some clients becoming more activist in their approach to things. So it does make it a little bit easier for us to work in those situations. They're good clients to have. Policymakers must allow the engineers into the discussion early on in setting the agenda. We're talking about, is the net zero realistic in that situation? And we have to kind of dumb it up a little bit because the public listens to certain simple explanations. And we design things to be run by engineers and not by either homeowners or the superintendents for large buildings and things like that. So we've got to do that. We've got to understand other people's perspectives, find ways to create efficiencies, and the stakeholders have their own particular concerns that we have to be cognizant of.
Okay, thank you, Paul. All right, group 4, lightning round.
All right, thanks. Hey, this is Haas Tabrizi presenting for on behalf of Group 4. So we talked about the application of smart cities, and in particular, we jumped right away into trying to benefit a marginalized segment of society or underserved or underprivileged area of a municipality. Started with some definitional context. So when we say smart city, what we mean is a geographic area that is interconnected, so as to be able to respond to a person's presence in the context of the community. Also suggests the infrastructure and environment is optimized for sustainability. So we talked a lot about sustainability, connectivity, optimization. We intentionally wanted to start with underserved areas, and by the way, none of this is on the shared Google Doc because we weren't able to get right access. So I'll just try to verbally summarize it here. So there's the current there's the issue of inequity currently, and there are typically many different parts of a given city or a community that might be at somewhat of an environmental or ecological disadvantage, say next to a freeway, or not having access to as nice of parks and recreational facilities that perhaps a more affluent area, a part of town has. So really wanted to get after that social inequity problem first, and I guess building on that, we didn't see a whole lot of downsides. I think frankly there's more upsides and positives and benefits than there are true risks here. But obviously we do run the risk of, as we deploy a smart city type technology, there's the potential that we might not keep up or other communities might want to, more affluent communities might want to take advantage of that. We were pretty quick in jumping to the consulting engineering or city engineer type of role, whether it's city engineer directly or outsourced. Shocker. That was kind of our natural default. But of course, just as conscious engineers, we need to be very intentional about demanding appropriate input. So really we talked a lot about early engagement of the community and engaging stakeholders within the community as part of a sort of a grassroots effort overall. So city and community leaders and capturing their voices was a particular interest to us. I would say that some of this will be put to the test as the group discussed around different interests and shaking up the status quo and kind of deploying and applying new technology. So all sorts of political and economic pressures there. And I think I would just simply close by saying that one of the other pieces we touched on as a group was a quote that Darshan shared earlier, which was, if you can see it, you can change it. In terms of group dynamic, we were very quick to kind of envision and imagine the possibilities here and the opportunity to really move the needle and make a difference environmentally, ecologically, perhaps economically. So kind of that, where there's a will, there's a way mentality, and doing some good here as a profession, as engineers. So quick jump to that city engineer or consulting engineer, technical advisor kind of a role, and lots of systems thinking, I would say, was also prevalent in our discussion. That's it.
Thanks, Haas. Group 5, lightning round.
Okay.
Really focused on the summary discussion.
Yep, we'll go there very quickly. Group 5, thank you, Nancy, for doing all the hard work of recording. It's all in there. We went with robotics, just pure randomness. We decided we were a biomed tech company, and then we took an easy route. We're nonprofit, fully funded to get started, so we went down that road. Then we even went into that we were going to deliver a COVID solution to the masses, and that was our biotech product. We would build a product with intellectual content that would do it quicker, faster for all the obvious savings that we could see, fast, repetitive, safety. But we also recognized with Group 1 that we might take away jobs, but we thought that was low. When we got down to the real the end summary of how we work together, we really firmed up that we could not really identify who our end customer was. Of course, we knew we delivered a product to the community, so we'd have to work and serve those people. But of course, we would need to really work with those people buying our product from us, and where would the funding go and what would be the scoping. When we really got to the end of the project idea, we got more scared than we were realistic, thinking, oh my God, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. The team kept moving to solutions quickly, but then we quickly iterated to a couple more problems, and then we all said we'd have to go back and talk more with our end customers, whoever they were. The good news with this team thing for us, we all were very collaborative. We all wanted to move quickly to solutions. But then there was a good enough scope within this team to recognize that we needed to talk to more people, and we would have to understand the real funding or who was really helping us get this accomplished. So overall, the dynamics of our team was good. None of us were real biometric people, and but it did bring in multiple perspectives that I guess we scared each other good enough to know we're probably not going to do this for real.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. So I will note, with this group, they're picking up a theme with some of the other groups is that, one of the things that happens, it looks like with this reflection on these questions is that it forces you to have that realization you need to engage more people, more stakeholders, a broader group. You need to convene them as part of this inquiry that you're about, as opposed to thinking as an engineer that you can sit up in your, in your office or your ivory tower or whatever and do it on your own. So, that notion of the reflection process and the questions helping push you out so that you're engaging in a more full way with the broader set of stakeholders is good. All right, group 6.
Okay, that's me, and I will be brief. Building upon what, first off, I guess, we use DAMS, and we were a consulting firm. And building upon what the other group said about engaging stakeholders, we went as far as to say that we need to make a conscious effort to engage marginalized communities. As engineers, we do a good job in engaging stakeholders, but we send out our public notices, and we expect those stakeholders that have a vested interest in the project will be engaged in the project, but those marginalized communities don't have access to that, typically, those public notices. So it may require a proactive approach on the part of engineers to work to actively engage those marginalized communities. And these issues or topics are cross-discipline boundaries. So no matter what engineering discipline or what area you work in, if we're going to be active, we need to actively engage those marginalized communities. So that requires better communication and reaching more diverse constituencies.
All right, thank you, Patty. Group 7.
Bill Stout reporting for Group 7. Lightning round. So a lot of the lessons learned that have already been stated, I think we came to. We brainstormed for a while what some of the social, political, environmental, ecological impacts would be of autonomous vehicles, which was our selected topic. I think that process really didn't necessarily give us any solutions, but I think what it did do was identify who were the stakeholders that we should be engaging to get the real answers. And so we did talk about stakeholder feedback, the implication in terms of pursuing that, given our code of ethics. An example Libby gave was the social injustice that occurred in cities with the building of the interstate highway system. That perhaps if we had engaged those communities as stakeholders more so, we would have relocated. And then in summary, not only we must think broader, but the means for so doing is to engage more perspectives in the discussion. And then finally, that we can't just think about the current impact, we need to think about the impact through the life cycle of the technology. So in our case, what are we going to do with all these electric vehicles at the end of the day when they run out of their lithium batteries?
All right, thanks. Thanks, Bill. All right, Group 8. Running toward the finish line here.
All right, it's me, it's Marcus. We were a biotech company, and our emerging technology that we chose was implantable. So implantable technologies, for the body. And let's see, I guess that we're meant to skip around a little bit. So, winners, we thought a little bit about, the ethics of everything, and especially in a moment in time where we're thinking a lot about inequality, we saw some real opportunities for losers, especially disadvantaged communities who may not have access to this kind of technology. So we put quite a bit of thought into that. The winners, of course, would be the usual, the data miners. And we thought, it's interesting. It's a lot like any other emerging tech where it benefits a select few initially, and it's only when it becomes commoditized and affordable that it moves out to other communities and benefits them more. We thought about, let's see, impact on climate, as something we didn't consider, but it's a sort of secondary and tertiary effect of even technology that's as personal as medical devices. We thought about end of life. Realize I'm skipping around a little bit, but thinking about things that are salient. Thinking about feedback from stakeholders, you know, we imagine that something as transformational as implantables would need a lot of you know, thoughtful study and discussion before we would even get to a prototyping stage, so that we could think through different eventualities, you know, as a result of this type of technology, and you know, looking for voices. Such as, you know, what you might get from a citizen review committee, but also engagement with the medical profession, and certainly looking at, you know, empirical lessons from the past with other early attempts at, you know, medical devices and implants. And we thought about things like conflicts that you know, we might personally experience, such as privacy. One that I thought was interesting was, you know, again, this emphasis on innovations also exacerbating inequality. I mean, there's so many here. One of the other things was really just around, you know, us eventually turning into cyborgs, and whether that's really, you know, the highest best use for the human existence. I think that's it. Lots of good stuff. I mean, really, you know, with regard to the team itself, you know, we commented on the fact that we are very heterogeneous, and, you know, we are able to really tease out and stimulate things that, you know, each of us on our own would never have come up with. So I think just the volume of, you know, Mark Abbott's great note-taking here is representative of, you know, the real-time rapid fire kind of discussion and feedback we were able to have. We also, you'll note the one bullet item on the screen, you know, we thought it was highly effective to have a real-time, you know, co-authored Google document, you know, for this type of quick rapid fire brainstorming. So a lot of good things of, you know, obviously we miss being in person, but there's some advantages to this format as well. And who knows, in the future, maybe we come up with a hybrid model where we're using these tools and we're in person. So that's it. I know we're running short on time, so I maybe I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Marcus. You know, I think this group, you know, raises some of those ethical issues. You know, just as a link back, you know, Rosalind Byrne from the National Academy of Engineering, you know, in our Berkeley Summit, really one of the pieces that she did, I think that's really stuck with us in terms of our language in the Change Lab is this notion of macroethics, and that engineers need to be, you know, able to move beyond the microethics that have been characteristic of most of the ethical work that engineers have done, to dealing with these larger macro ethical issues that particularly come when you look at these larger systems. And I think that showed up consistently in the conversation using these questions. So, you know, just as you know, a little bit of airtime, other points of discussion, again, not about the technologies you were exploring, but about this experience, about this notion that Darshan was laying out about doing systems thinking through this you know, inquiry process, reflection and awareness of using these questions. Other thoughts or comments that you might have as group members here. And here I'm just going to try and, you know, we'll allow people to jump in, unmute themselves and jump in if you've got a comment.
And tell me if I'm crazy too.
Yeah, okay.
You are crazy. We need that kind of crazy.
This is Nancy Prudhomme, and we had the pleasure of having Darshan in our breakout group. So we talked about his, the provocateur, and that it really did bring that different level of challenge and thinking to we just jumped right in at that level. And so I appreciate all the provocateurs this morning, and it allowed us to really step in at a much higher level if we hadn't heard those conversations. So thanks to all the provocateurs.
Kyle, this is Charlie. And I
Yeah,
think one thing that came up in our group was that we were tending to focus on a project or a technology throughout our discussion, but at the very end, I think Darshan's hypothesis or what he's proposing is, a much greater worldwide paradigm shift. And that, we were wondering, do engineers on their own have enough thrust to really change the political and social and environmental structures that are already in place? And I mean, I know that's a big question, but we did jump to that sort of big whole picture.
Charlie, this is Mike. I had a similar thought. It started with Bill Stout's question in the early sessions of how do we get our clients involved in thinking more broadly, and it illustrated, and that's from a private consultant perspective, obviously, but it illustrated for me the need to broaden the conversation of topics like this within the entire engineering ecosystem, and that all of us have this role to play in doing that as we take these discussions outside of our summits.
Good, thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Others?
Yeah, if I could add on to go back to what Charles was saying, we can't just let policymakers choose our values. So, we have to be involved in that discussion, or we're going to lose out on how, whose values are we, doing active engineering to activist engineering to, right? So we can't just only hear the vocal majority. We have to be able to influence with the silent majority too, for the people, the end users that are going to be using products or services or whatever. And engineers are going to have to go outside of our comfort zone in order to be part of that policy discussion.
Yeah, I would just link there that there's a strong linkage between the work that that we're simulating in this, using Darshan's reflection process, and the work that we're going to be doing on next Thursday morning, where we're looking at how can engineers more proactively engage in shaping that public policy. And so I think there are means that have not been the typical role that engineers have assumed for themselves in order to do that. But it's interesting that, the motivation for engaging in that public policy work on the leadership in that realm could come from this type of reflection where you realize the challenge or the ethical problems or the possibility with regard to policies that might come. So, as we come back to that session, or as we come into that session next Thursday, we'll have the ability to come back to this discussion, I think.
See, Mark Abbott has his hand raised. Mark, go ahead if you have a comment.
Yeah, I was just thinking about on the policy side, as a society, we kind of recognize that with our laws, our government, we have democracy as a way of kind of an imperfect way of ensuring that different kind of considerations are brought to the fore. On the technology side, the engineers were creating these powerful technologies that I would argue are having, a similar greater impact on our lives as our laws, even. So how can we kind of, what can we learn from sort of democracy and the sort of political systems and policy making that we could actually bring to really extend, how we think about the engineering process? I'd argue engineering is too important a process to be left to engineers. So all the conversation we're having about collaboration, what are some ways we could really stretch that? And I think Darshan's questions are just amazing for that, because I think, especially for engineers, I can really imagine those sorts of questions being embedded right in design processes. But if those questions were actually at different gates and in different stages of design in different contexts, I think it could really open the door to those broader conversations in a practical way.
Yeah, great comment, Mark. There's a I don't know the name that goes along with the telephone number, but the 608-857 telephone number here that has your hand up. Who is that?
And then Maury Sauls after that.
Okay. Do we know who that is? Give him a moment to unmute. Well, in that case, we're going to go to Maury.
Well, thanks. It just seems to me that as engineers, sometimes we take the given from someone, whether it be our client, a project given, that this is the thing we have to achieve. And they always want to maximize the result, right? Given a certain budget. I think it's important as engineers that we try to descale sometimes and put more financial power behind the circular aspects of a project. How do we make it better for the total? Back to your comment, Darshan, the economic model needs to be scaled better. And as engineers, it's on us to bring those arguments of, okay, maybe the bridge has to be a little bit smaller or a little different structure to make it usable for the long term or recyclable. Sometimes we don't stand up enough for those long-term motivations. That's just my feedback.
Okay, one more comment and then we're going to, if somebody wants to make it, and then we're going to close for today.
Yeah, Stu Wallace, to follow up on Maury's comment, and I don't want to sound arrogant, but I don't think we should ever let, those of us in consulting, let the client define the problem. Because if we do that, we may cause some unexpected results, or we may miss out on some fabulous opportunities. Certainly we need to address what they perceive as the problem, but we need to step back and define that problem in the context of what would be the real problem or the real challenge. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, well, just, let me, good comments, great work on the exercise as I went from group to group to group. We'll have that Google document, as a record of your work, just like if we had the flip chart sheets there that you can download if you wish. And continue to think about in terms of that perspective. You've got access to the Darshan's article where he's laying out both the concept of activist engineering, but also the version of these questions which were included in that article, which I think Mike had sent out to everyone. So you've got that for reference as well as the questions here. I think as a concluding comment from my perspective on this, I mean, exploring this entanglement of society and technology, an agenda for doing that has been on the table with regard to particularly academic engineering for quite a long time, 50 years, as they develop programs around, I guess, STS or science, technology, and society, which have been embedded into engineering schools. But I think what this, and we've been doing systems thinking for 50 years, going back to the 60s, as a lot of that initial work, particularly in terms of, the Horst Riddle's ideas of wicked problems and messes from that perspective showed up. This stuff has been on the table, but I think what's highlighted here, and I think what emerges with the provocations as well as the exercise, is that there are opportunities in the future of engineering to bring this type of work, the consideration, from a systems perspective of these larger surrounding pieces to the traditional work of engineers, and both an enrichment of the possibilities in terms of doing better for society, but also a shift in the role of engineers in terms of engaging in facilitating these types of conversations, and also taking on a role much more fully with regard to public policy. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to keep building on these ideas this morning as we move through the other 3 sessions here. Tomorrow we're going to be moving into a particular part of this larger system, the environmental sustainability question, and we want to take a look at first the work that the Lemelson Foundation and VentureWell are doing in terms of trying to establish this, perspective about environmentally responsible engineering at the academic level, and then what could that look like with respect to leading that type of work, and not only in the academic world, but how does that show up with regard to practice? And we'll have a series of provocateurs that will be able to listen to their stories. And the provocateurs tomorrow are people who have been engaged in that leadership of environmentally responsible design, whether engineering or in another case, architecture. But what is that, what does leadership look like in that realm? And how can we begin to put together, a model for thinking about the leadership that's needed in order to deal with that larger part of the system with which we work? As we wrap up, if you have feedback in terms of how we did today, we'd appreciate it. Just, send an email to either Mike or I. And we'll continue to try and improve each of these sessions as we go through the days. This is new territory for us trying to do these things virtually. So we certainly appreciate your patience. And as I say, if you've got feedback for how we can do even tomorrow better, let us know. And with that, again, thanks to Ayana, to Darshan, to Guru for offering, for getting us off to such a great start in your provocations. Mike, do you have anything to close?
Just a quick add on to what Kyle said. We are saving everything. We're recording the session. We are saving the chat. We will have the presentations available. And of course, we have the Google Doc. So. And for those of you, again, just to reiterate, if you could not access the Google Doc, please just reach out to Kyle and he can grant you that permission.
I think there's a button or something in the Google Doc itself to request permission to edit.
All right, and I'll just say thank you again, and to most of you, hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.